Welcome back, everyone, to Eat the Rich. I'm Chris, and I'm your host for this one. So I was thinking, we've sure covered a lot of topics on the show these past 3 years, and I'm not an expert in any one of them. I'm not an academic. I didn't even finish college or do particularly well the time that I did go, in part because of the topic of this episode. And so I thought, wouldn't it be a nice little change of pace to do an episode where I do get to talk about something that I actually am an expert in? So here it is. I've done the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours thing for doing heroin, so I'm a real bona fide expert. And I wanted to do this episode because I'm so alarmed by what I'm hearing about the state of the illicit opioid supply in the United States that I wanted to offer some of my perspective. So rather than our usual wheelhouse of the obscene wealth and depravity of the people at the very top of our economic system, I wanted to do something that would bring into focus the people who are allowed to fall through its cracks. Inevitably allowing a small number of people to hoard most of the wealth has had disastrous societal impacts for the rest of us. Poverty and income inequality are at the heart of multiple overlapping crises. We have a crisis of homelessness in the United States. We have a crisis of drug addiction and overdose death. Addiction, of course, can affect anyone, but the people without the means or the ability to get treatment, the people that are, living on the streets and simultaneously dealing with an addiction issue, those are the people that are really suffering and that I really, feel for and think about a lot. And for people whose housing situations were already precarious, adding a drug addiction to that is all that it could take to push them into homelessness. And as the cost of living continues to rise and wages stay stagnant, housing is only going to get more precarious for more people. Homelessness is a choice, but only so far as we choose to continue to allow it to exist. It's a societal failure is what it really is. It's a societal failure that we allow people to suffer and die on the streets like this. But since we love to individualize societal failure so much as a country, we put the responsibility on the individual sufferer. We call it a mental health issue. We call it an addiction issue. And those issues may be there also as well, but that's not why they're on the street. They're on the street because of an inequality issue. They're on the street because of a poverty issue. And you hear the same sort of thing after mass shootings as well, about mental health. It's just we just have a complex, intractable mental health issue in this country, and there's just no way to, prevent or solve any of this. Now, this episode is about fentanyl. I'm talking about homelessness too, because to me, they're just inextricably linked to me personally. That's, certainly not to say that all people who are homeless have addiction issues. Not by any means. There are any number of paths to becoming homeless in the United States. Addiction is just one of them. It happens to be the one that I took. So I don't really think about one issue without thinking about the other one. And I would like to do a series of episodes about homelessness in the United States. So I guess we can sort of consider this like a pilot episode of that. Homelessness and drug addiction, these are the issues that are, probably on my mind most often. And look, men will literally do a podcast about their trauma instead of go to therapy. But things are particularly bad right now for the homeless. We're seeing what feels like just the beginning of a new wave of right-wing reaction to rising crime rates and rising rates of homelessness and petty theft and quality of life issues related to homelessness in cities. And from the recall of San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin to the voter turnout for the billionaire Rick Caruso, who is running for was just running in the Los Angeles mayoral primary, to Tennessee, where on July 1st, Tennessee will become the first state in the nation to make it a felony to camp on public property like parks. They already made it a felony to camp on private property back in 2020. And by the way, there are more people experiencing homelessness on a given night in Tennessee than there are existing available shelter beds. So they're not only making just existing a felony for some people. They're doing it without, giving them even an alternative. So yet again, rather than doing anything at all to address the long-standing structural issues that are upstream of homelessness and drug addiction, instead of putting housing first and giving people that are on the street the stability they need to have a fighting chance at treating their other issues, we're just throwing more money and military surplus at the police, which doesn't do anything at all except brutalize people even more. And we're seeing like a resurgence of the like totally debunked broken windows ideology of policing, which suggests that, being too soft on minor crimes like fare evasion and loitering and vandalism and quality of life crimes creates an environment of social disorder and chaos that encourages more criminal activity and where more serious crimes are likely to occur. It creates an atmosphere of criminality where anything goes. And so by cracking down on the enforcement of these crimes, you create an atmosphere of order and lawfulness. And this is what Rudy Giuliani did in the 90s when he was the mayor of New York City. Bill Bratton was the police commissioner at the time, and he's been one of the main proponents of this of the broken windows ideology. And he later, after he left New York, he then I think became the police commissioner of Los Angeles as well, and sort of carried on these same ideas in Los Angeles. And there's no evidence at all. I mean, this is hokum. It's all bullshit. There's no evidence to support that this actually leads to a decrease in violent crime. Giuliani in particular loves to pat himself on the back because, crime rates did go down in New York City in the mid-90s, but crime rates also went down everywhere in the country at the same time. So, no matter if they were doing the broken windows thing or not. And this, of course, is used to target the homeless for the inevitable quality of life issues that just come up with having a lot of people living on the streets. And look, I get it. Nobody wants to see people shooting up on the sidewalk and that kind of stuff. The quality of life issues that come with homelessness do affect everyone. And they do and they can make life worse for anyone who has to be around it, not just the homeless. But the solutions that are being offered don't do anything to address any of the root causes that put those people on the street, and they're certainly not going to do anything to prevent anybody else from ending up on the street. We're seeing just a doubling down on decades of failed law and order bullshit. And where we're seeing the reactionary turn is in our nominally left-wing political party, right? I mean, these are the liberal bastions. San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City, just electing Eric Adams. He's another sort of example of this, former NYPD captain, taking a very pro-cop, very law and order tone about addressing crime in the city. Currently, right now, the Los Angeles County District Attorney, George Gascon, he's in the middle of his second recall attempt. He's another one who's been criticized for a supposed soft on crime approach. I mentioned him actually on the show a couple months back after Dave Chappelle was attacked on stage, because that happened in Los Angeles, and Gascon was criticized after that for only charging the guy with misdemeanors instead of summarily executing him for doing cancel culture. I do think there's a pretty good chance that that Gascon could be recalled this time, especially after they just had success recalling Chesa Boudin in San Francisco. They just got the 650,000 signatures that they need to get this on the ballot this fall, so this will be put to a vote this fall. Actually, just today, I think it was the city of El Monte, which is in Los Angeles County, city officials there just took a vote of no confidence in Gascon. There was 2 cops that were shot and killed last week in El Monte, and this has been a really big rallying cry for the recall movement. Apparently, the shooter got a plea deal last year that allowed him to stay out on probation instead of going to prison. And Gascon is, of course, being blamed for letting this guy walk. But it wasn't a violent crime that he was charged with then. What do you want? What do you expect him to do? He had no history of violence. Do you want everyone arrested for any crime sent to prison for 20 years just in case they might also kill someone later on? We already have the highest incarceration rate in the world, which I think is a pretty good indicator that just sending more people to prison doesn't help anything, especially when you also consider that other advanced economies with smaller, lower rates of incarceration also largely don't experience issues with violent crime to the same extent that we do. But you don't even need to look to other countries either to see that that's all bullshit. 100 miles from Los Angeles is Bakersfield, California, which is in Kern County in the southern part of the Central Valley. Kern County is solidly Republican. Donald Trump won Kern County easily in 2016 and 2020. In fact, the last time a Democratic presidential candidate won the majority of votes was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. The mayor of Bakersfield is a Republican. The Kern County DA is the kind of DA that the recall supporters in San Francisco and in Los Angeles would like to see. There's no way you could, accuse the Kern County District Attorney of being soft on crime, loves cops, hates prosecuting cops when they kill people, loves sending people to prison. And there's no real active, defund the police movement to speak of in Kern County in 2021 and in 2020 when we saw that in a lot of other places. So you can't say that that's behind crime in Kern County either. And wouldn't you know it, Kern County has the highest homicide rate in the state of California, actually significantly higher than in San Francisco County, about 3 times as much in 2020. Using 2020 as an example, San Francisco had 48 homicides in the year, and Kern County had 140 homicides in the year. And that's San Francisco County and Kern County, and they're actually both very close in size. They're pretty close. Both areas are pretty close to each other in population. Kern County had another 136 homicides last year in 2021, and they've recorded 52 so far this year. Stockton, California is another one. Stockton is less than 100 miles from San Francisco. They also have a Republican mayor. Not a DA that you could call lenient, and a significantly higher homicide rate than in San Francisco. San Francisco actually has relatively average rates of violent crime for cities of that size. In fact, they have relatively low rates of violent crime in compared to a lot of other American cities. And actually, violent crime did not see as much of an increase in 2020 in San Francisco as, there was not as much of an increase in San Francisco that year as there was in some other places after the start of the pandemic. In fact, the only types of crimes that actually are becoming more common in San Francisco are property crimes, theft and shoplifting, car break-ins, burglaries, that kind of stuff. And despite whatever broken windows proponents would like to say, there's no proven correlation between property crime and property crime rates and violent crime rates. Otherwise, why would we, just taking these two cities that are in the same state and very close to each other, San Francisco, many cities in California struggle with large homeless populations. I don't think it's as, I don't think quite as to the degree as it is in San Francisco, but certainly other parts of California don't have the out of control shoplifting and property crimes and things like that, like San Francisco has, and miraculously, they still have more murders than San Francisco. San Francisco then has all of this property crime and then does not have the violent crime that's supposed to be coming as a byproduct of that. And I think it's very telling that San Francisco is always the city singled out for this kind of reactionary, soft on crime, Democrat-run city criticism. This is like San Francisco, of course, is a favorite target of Fox News. Bill O'Reilly. At least once a week, basically, he'd have like the rundown on why Nancy Pelosi lets everyone shit on the street in San Francisco. By the way, I watched, Bill O'Reilly still has a show. I don't even know what was watching him on YouTube earlier today because he was talking about the George Gascon recall. And you'll be happy to know that he looks like shit. And apparently nobody's watching his show. But San Francisco is always the one that's singled out. Sure, there are other California cities with much more violent crime, but what's really important is protecting the class interests of the business owners and the property owners in the city. That's what it really comes down to. The large, visible homeless population is the difference. At the heart of it, that's what it's really all about. People are scared of the homeless. People look at the homeless and see criminality, and they'll say, "How can we help these people?" They say, "I need help. I'm the one that needs help because I have to look at these people and be around these people, and they might steal my bike. And what I need is for all these people to just go away, no matter how that's done. They need to, either bootstrap themselves into a job in a house or just go to prison. They're only out there by choice anyway. It's because the city gives them so many services that they take advantage of it. It has nothing to do with a one-bedroom apartment costing $3,000 a month. And ultimately, this is what you get when you're just unable to look at this stuff outside the confines of capitalism. Housing is a human right. It has to come first. You have to meet people where they are and treat them with dignity. Everyone deserves the dignity of a private space to call their own. The stability that comes from housing is absolutely critical. You can't expect to treat the other issues first when people are still on the street. You just can't arrest people off the street and expect it to solve anything either. But since under capitalism, housing is not a human right, it's a commodity to be bought and sold, and it's an asset for investment. Healthcare, also a commodity. So just giving that shit away for free to people who didn't earn it is just too radical to even be considered, which is so short-sighted. A lot of people really seem to resent the idea of someone getting something for free when they feel like they had to work for it. It's part of this uniquely American disease of individualism, which has just rotted away people's empathy. And I think that there's some idea that housing first, as opposed to a shelter system with rigid rules and supervision, that they're just giving people too much freedom, and that people will take advantage of that. They think that people will just take the housing and just continue getting high and committing crimes while the taxpayer funds it. And you know what? Some of them will. Some of them will. It's a long way back for someone who's been homeless for a really long time. We can't do means testing to figure out which ones are worthy of help. The bigger picture that's being missed there is that guaranteeing housing in the long run is also going to prevent future people from ending up on the street in the first place and getting to a point where they're so far gone that it's hard to come back. And it's frustrating. And it's disheartening to observe all of this as someone who's been there, because everybody is worthy of help. I know very intimately what it's like to be on the street and how hard it is to get out of that situation. And I guess I'd like to have the opportunity to talk about that kind of stuff more. So stay tuned for that, I guess. But I felt compelled to go ahead and do this episode first because I'm so alarmed, like I mentioned, by what I'm seeing in the news about the state of the illicit opioid supply in the United States and also Canada. Look, I use drugs for a long time. The landscape of the illicit opioid market today is totally unrecognizable to me, basically. It's completely unrecognizable from what it was 10 years ago. In some parts of the country, particularly in the West Coast, it's unrecognizable from what it was even 2 years ago. It's not heroin anymore at all in most places. And for as deadly and awful and life-destroying as heroin is, what's out there today is much, much worse. I think that some of the reporting on this still gives the impression that it's heroin cut with fentanyl, which was once true, but that's not really the case anymore. In most of the country, it's all fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. And in some cases, it's just a benzodiazepine, like Xanax, or it's not that they're putting Xanax in there. Benzodiazepine is a drug like Xanax, which is, by the way, very dangerous to mix with opiates. But it's being, what we're seeing now, in addition to just fentanyl, is we're seeing this sort of wave of poly drug wave of fentanyl and various fentanyl analogs cut with benzos or cut with tranquilizers, or other other synthetic drugs that are still being tested for and still being discovered. Right? There's at least 1,400, 1,500 fentanyl analogs. There's so many different drugs out there. It's not all heroin anymore. It's not even all fentanyl anymore. And real heroin is just about extinct in most of the United States now. And because of how quickly that happened, I don't think all the ways in which fentanyl is worse are even commonly understood yet. Fentanyl is more potent than heroin. It's easier to overdose on. That all is well known. But there are other issues with it as well that complicate detox and recovery and just make daily life worse and way harder and more desperate for people who are using it. Fentanyl has changed the game entirely, and the response and the way addiction is treated is going to need to change as well. Even in the addiction treatment field, it seems like there's only an emerging understanding of all the complications that fentanyl presents, and there's a lot of misinformation out there as well, as you've seen from the ridiculous Havana syndrome-like phenomenon of cops falling out after touching fentanyl. There's a lot of misinformation out there that continues to persist. So I wanted to talk a little bit about all of that, and I guess give what you'd call an oral history of how fentanyl replaced heroin in the United States. And some of the sourcing for this will be, I guess, anecdotal. The sourcing that's more academic will be in the show notes. A lot of that comes from one person, Dr. Dan Ciccarone from the University of California, San Francisco, who has researched heroin in the United States for decades. There was a recent Vice documentary as well that I'll link in the show notes about the benzos and the tranquilizers in the fentanyl supply in Vancouver and Philadelphia. And it was really jarring for me. And after I watched that, that's one of the really what drove me to want to do this episode, because I had not known to the extent to which fentanyl had already come to replace heroin on the West Coast, which we'll get into all of that. For reasons we'll get into, the West Coast had remained relatively free of fentanyl for a lot longer than other parts of the country, particularly the East Coast. And fentanyl only hit some West Coast cities in like 2020 or 2021. And look, this is a world that I was a part of for a lot of years, and have continued to observe from afar. And I had anticipated that fentanyl would completely replace heroin in the United States one day. It just seemed inevitable. But I'll tell you, I'm pretty shocked at how quickly it seems to be happening. So, first of all, a little bit about what fentanyl is exactly. I'm sure you've all heard of it, but it's a synthetic opioid. It's made totally in a lab. There's no opium poppy in it as a precursor, like in morphine and in heroin and some other natural and semi-synthetic opioids. It was first developed in the late 1950s by a Belgian chemist, and it was first approved for medical use in the United States in 1968. It's lipophilic. Remember this, because this will come back. But it's lipophilic, meaning that it has a tendency to combine in or dissolve in fats in the body. So it has an easier time crossing the blood-brain barrier than other opioids do. This is what gives it a very rapid onset of effects. Likewise, the duration of its effects are much shorter than with other opioids, generally under 2 hours or so. And this can be very desirable in a clinical setting. A short duration of effects is definitely not desirable if you're a drug user. I can guarantee you that. But that is what was so desirable about it initially in a clinical setting. It could be used for it allowed procedures that used to require a longer hospital stay to be done in a day, and the patient could go home afterwards because of its strength when used as an anesthesia, but it's also its short duration. You can in clinical settings you could cease giving it to somebody in 40 minutes to an hour. The effects have basically worn off already. It is much more potent than other opioids. It's around 100 times stronger than morphine and 50 times stronger than heroin. And, originally it was used only in hospitals and in clinical settings, and it was given by IV, mostly for a lot of time for managing cancer pain and for anesthesia and stuff like that. And then in the 1990s, as it started to be used more for pain management and stuff like that, preparations were developed that allowed it to be used in an outpatient setting. The fentanyl patch came first, like a nicotine patch that you put right on your skin. And then they came out with the fentanyl lollipops. And these were used in pain management. They allowed a slow, steady amount of the drug to be released over a longer period of time. And, these were abused. Of course, you used to be able to cut the patches open and get the gel out of them and then ingest it in some other way. But eventually they changed the formulation of those. But that was what fentanyl abuse looked like up until more recently. It was prescription drugs manufactured by a pharmaceutical company, prescribed by a doctor, and then that was then diverted and sold on the street and abused. This is not at all the type of fentanyl that's on the street today. But this is the first wave of what Dr. Ciccarone calls the triple wave of the opioid crisis, which really started in the 1990s. Before the 1990s, if you asked someone who was heroin dependent what drug they'd started using first, heroin or prescription pills, most of them would have said heroin. That started flipping in the 1990s with the overprescription of opioid painkillers, primarily OxyContin. And OxyContin was aggressively marketed, by Purdue pharmaceutical salesmen, aggressively marketed to doctors, as we talked about in a recent episode as well, with the help of our friends at McKinsey & Company Consulting. They very aggressively marketed this to doctors as a more safe and less addictive alternative to other painkillers like morphine, which is ridiculous and honestly really incredible to think about somebody trying to tell a doctor that just 25 years ago, and the doctor apparently just going along with it. Because the only thing that was supposed to make it time release was the film. I mean, this is why they said it was less likely, less addictive and safer, because it was time release. It was a time release formula, releases the drug in the system slowly over a longer period of time. Of course, originally you could simply remove that film, the time release film, and then crush up the pill, and then then you just have 80 milligrams of oxycodone that you can ingest any number of ways, and you'll get it all at once. And it's really wild to think that just in the 90s, this was that they tried to push any kind of opiate as safer and less addictive. It's actually also how heroin itself even started. Heroin is a brand name given to it by Bayer. It's actually called diamorphine, I think is actually the name of the drug itself. Heroin is a brand name. Heroin was also in the early 1900s originally marketed as safer and less addictive than morphine. So they tried all of that once before. And it's one thing in the early 1900s, but it's pretty wild that apparently doctors just either believed it or didn't care and went along with it just for the money as recently as 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And throughout this time, heroin use was already on the rise, as we saw this huge overprescribing of, prescription opiates. But then in 2010, they reformulated the OxyContin 80s to try to make them abuse-proof. And so they made them so that when you would crush them up, they would gum up instead of crushing up into a powder. And that was to, make it so that they couldn't then be snorted or injected or anything like that. And, that's the same year, 2010, that we really start seeing heroin overdose rates becoming more common. Heroin use was already, like I said, already on the rise around 2006, 2007. That was really when rates of heroin use started rising exponentially, much more so than they had in the past. And then over the next, over the next 5 years or so, as prescription pills become less common, as they, like I said, like I mentioned, they made the fentanyl patches abuse proof. They started making like the OxyContins abuse proof. And so, now after they've flooded the market with all of these opiates, and now they've made it so that people can't use them to get high. Well, people are going to start to turn to heroin more and more, and this is the period where kind of we see the start of the second wave, the heroin wave of the this triple wave of opiates, and by 2014, heroin overdose deaths had already outpaced deaths from other opioids. Simultaneously, beginning in 2013, we started seeing more and more fentanyl in supplies of street heroin, and by 2015, overdose deaths involving fentanyl had already outpaced deaths involving heroin alone or prescription opiates, like less than 2 years from it really like hitting the streets in earnest. And like I said, what we're seeing now isn't diverted prescription fentanyl. It's illicitly produced fentanyl powder, and it's absolutely everywhere. There were more than 80,000 opioid overdose deaths in the United States in 2021. 71,000 of those involved fentanyl. So it's no secret that fentanyl is driving overdose deaths. Some of the reporting on this, though, I think still seems to suggest that it's heroin cut with fentanyl, which used to be the case, but in most places now it's just fentanyl. There's no heroin at all to be found. And in some places, it's already been like that for a few years, but it's all happened so quickly. Fentanyl hit the East Coast first. I was living on the East Coast then, and I was using drugs and had been for some time. I don't remember exactly when the dope started seeming different. Probably was 2013, but I guess it was around 2014 when it became pretty commonly known, even to to the people using it, that it was being cut with fentanyl. But you could still get heroin pretty much everywhere, and what you were getting was not all fentanyl. It was heroin cut with fentanyl. Incidentally, I actually left the East Coast around that time. I had ended up homeless there on the East Coast, and I just decided to, rather than hang around in my hometown being homeless, I just decided to start hitchhiking. So that's what I did, and I hitchhiked across the country, and I stayed clean for a while I was doing that, and actually had a pretty good time. But eventually, I ended up in San Francisco, where I started using again. And I spent the next couple of years there in the Bay Area, homeless, mostly in San Francisco, but also Santa Rosa, until I came back to the East Coast in early 2017. And I'm telling you all of this because by the time I got back to the East Coast in 2017, it was pretty much, heroin was pretty much already gone in most places. The other thing that you should know is that due to a peculiarity of the U.S. heroin market, the type of heroin that you could get varied depending on where you were in the country. Powder heroin was dominant on the East Coast, and the black tar variety of heroin was dominant west of the Mississippi, particularly west of the Rockies. Like on the West Coast, you would not see powder at all. It's weird to talk about all that in past tense, but it pretty much is now. And the reason for all of this is it's starting in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Colombian traffickers took over supplying heroin to the East Coast. Prior to that, from what I understand, this is before my time, obviously, but from what I understand, there used to be 3 to 4 major sources of heroin to the United States. Significant amounts used to come from Asia in the 1970s and 80s. By the early to mid 90s, most heroin in the U.S. was coming from Colombia and Mexico. And the method of refining preferred by the Colombian cartels yields a powder, and that was what they were sending to the East Coast. Black tar heroin is the result of a less complex process of refinement that yields like a gummy and oily tar, and it's what was more commonly produced in Mexico and then distributed through the Western United States. By the early 2000s, less and less heroin, though, was coming from Colombia every year. So by around 2010, more of the East Coast heroin as well was also coming from Mexico. By 2014, 80% of heroin nationwide came from Mexico, and that's well over 90% now. What's interesting to me about that is that like divide between the supply was still maintained, even though it was all at that point coming from Mexico. They still sent all the tar to the West Coast and all the powder to the East Coast, I guess, because that's what the market there, that's what the people there are used to, and that's what they're expecting. And this is a very plausible explanation for why fentanyl hit the East Coast first, because fentanyl is also a powder, and so you're just going to have an easier time cutting it into another powder than you will with tar. And so by 2017, fentanyl and fentanyl analogs had already largely replaced heroin in most East Coast cities. By 2017, already 50 to 60% of all opioid overdose deaths in New York City involved fentanyl or a fentanyl analog. And it hadn't even really hit the West Coast yet by that time. The California heroin supply was still largely free of fentanyl. In 2016, in Riverside County, California, this is just an example to illustrate how drastic it was when it hit the West Coast as well. In 2016, there were 2 overdose deaths involving fentanyl in Riverside County, California. 5 years later, by 2021, that number jumped to 404 overdose deaths attributed to fentanyl in Riverside County, California. There have been 110 fentanyl overdose deaths there in just the first 4 months of this year. When fentanyl hit the West Coast, it hit San Francisco first. That wasn't until 2019. When I left San Francisco in 2017, there was no fentanyl to be found, basically. And it just became more common in 2019 and more common in the rest of the state by 2020. And then it very quickly seems to have spread throughout the rest of the West Coast. And this is happening right now. And this is happening, I'm not entirely sure the extent of the availability of heroin in West Coast cities. I'm sort of interested in knowing that, because it seems like from the more that I find out, it just seems like it's all fentanyl, which has been the reality on the East Coast, like I said, for many years. But it's pretty shocking that it's happened on to the entire country so quickly and so completely. And if you look at like the drug overdose deaths by year in San Francisco, you can very clearly see when fentanyl hit. San Francisco has historically had lower overdose rates than other American cities. San Francisco has a longer standing and more robust network of harm reduction services that are available, and they distribute naloxone widely. Naloxone, commonly also known as Narcan, the opioid overdose reversal agent. But in San Francisco, drug overdose deaths, and this is all drug overdose deaths, not just opioid, but in 2017 there was 222 in the city. In 2018 there was 259. Not much of a change there. 2019, when fentanyl first started appearing, we have 441 overdose deaths in San Francisco. Then the next year, 2020, we have 711, and then 640 in 2021. San Francisco also keeps track of opioid overdoses reversed by Narcan in the city. In 2017, there was 1,269. In 2018, 1,656. In 2019, 2,610. And in 2020, 2,155. And what's really stunning is that those are just the ones that are recorded. Like I said, naloxone is distributed widely to normal people in San Francisco. Lots of people that are in that world that are using drugs have fentanyl. I mean, not have fentanyl, have naloxone. They have fentanyl as well, unfortunately. But So there's probably most of the opioid overdoses reversed by Narcan are not even showing up in these numbers because there's nobody, these are just the ones that are given in hospitals or by first responders and stuff like that. So in 2022, it appears that fentanyl has proliferated everywhere, and heroin has just about disappeared completely in the United States and Canada as well, it seems. But why is this? What's driving this? Is it because fentanyl is so good? I've seen it suggested that because fentanyl is more potent than heroin, that it must be more in demand, and that's why, that's what's driving this, is that everybody's clamoring to get the fentanyl because it's so good. I assure you that's absolutely not true. Nobody wants fentanyl. Nobody asked for fentanyl. It infiltrated the heroin supply. It was introduced as an adulterate without anybody's knowledge. The market forces that are driving the proliferation of fentanyl are on the producer's side, not the consumer's side. From the manufacturer's point of view, from the trafficker's point of view, heroin is a loser's game compared to fentanyl. First of all, heroin has to come from a farmed precursor. It has to come from the opium poppy. And just that part of it right there is relying on so much uncertainty. It's costly and it's labor intensive to cultivate it. It takes months to grow. You have to worry about the police or the military finding it. It could just all fucking burn down one day. And then once you have a cultivated product, that may have to then be shipped to another country where it's then refined into heroin. And then once you do have a finished product to ship, it takes up a lot of space. It's really smelly. You then have to try to probably illegally, secretly sneak it across a border or something. It's smelly. It takes up a lot of space. It's difficult to conceal. So why would you go through all of that when you can just order a couple kilograms of fentanyl precursor by mail off the internet, mix it up and cut it up, and then make 10 times what you put into it? Fentanyl is so much more potent. The amount of material that you're working with is so much smaller and easier to transport. So like any other business, the point is to maximize profits, even at the expense of maybe killing a few of your customers along the way. This is why, to me, the writing was on the wall years ago that fentanyl would completely take over like this. Did not think it would happen so quickly or so completely. Some of the illicit fentanyl in the United States comes directly from China by mail. Not so much anymore. That was more common from like 2014 to 2018. A lot of the fentanyl then was coming straight from China or India to the United States. Some of it was going to Mexico at that point and being trafficked in, but a lot of it was being sent directly to the United States. And there was this sort of whack-a-mole game that went on for a while with fentanyl and the fentanyl analogs, where a chemist somewhere would tweak the fentanyl chemical in some way to make it technically different chemically to get around the law so that they can continue to sell it and ship it. And then once, that one would get made illegal, and then they'd come up with a new analog by tweaking something else, and this goes on and on and on ad infinitum. There's, like I mentioned, hundreds, probably, well in excess of 1,500 of these by now. And so for a little while, this is how it worked, with the analogs being created and shipped directly to the United States, where they were then added to the existing heroin supply as a cut, right? And this is critical, because this is really what the difference is now. Because then what happened in 2019 and 2020, a couple things happened that really changed the game and saw fentanyl really start to take over the entire country. The first thing was in May 2019, China banned any synthetic opioid that resembles fentanyl, whereas previously they just banned the specific compounds at a time as they were created. And they also, began restricting more the export of fentanyl and fentanyl precursors to the United States. So what started happening was these same companies, they can no longer sell the fentanyl, but they can sell the precursors, and they can sell the ingredients. So what we're seeing today is these precursors being shipped not to the United States, but to Mexico, where they're where they're being combined and cooked up in cartel labs and then exported to the United States using the existing drug trafficking networks. And the other thing that happened around the same time was obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, which created all kinds of supply chain issues for everyone, drug traffickers and poppy cultivators included. Poppy cultivation is on the decline. The amount of poppy cultivated in Mexico decreased by 24% from 2019 to 2020. And poppy cultivation throughout Mexico has fallen at nearly 50% since its high in 2017. And so this is what's really driving the proliferation of fentanyl now. And it was still, some of it still came in, some of it was still trafficked in across the border and stuff like that. But largely, most of it was at the time being mailed directly to the United States by some, and then, received by some middleman somewhere and then cut into the existing heroin supply that had already been brought into the country. So even though it was in a lot of places, it was more localized. What we're seeing now is it's being sent directly to the cartels first and then being brought into the United States using their same trafficking network that used to bring the heroin. This is why it's everywhere now. This is why it's on the West Coast as well, and all these places that it historically was not for the longest time. Interestingly, it seems like some dealers in Vancouver, and I saw this on that Vice documentary, some dealers in Vancouver are still going through the trouble of rocking the fentanyl up, like cooking it up and rocking it up into little chunks and then selling it, instead of a powder, selling it as like little individual chunks because I guess it more closely resembles tar heroin because that's what the market there is used to. Now, this does seem to be limited to the United States and Canada so far. The fentanyl, other places with significant populations of opioid users still have heroin. I know Europe and Australia do. A lot of that is coming from Asia, coming from Afghanistan and Southeast Asia and places like that. But fentanyl isn't just sold as a powder. But by the way, I do. I'm really wondering if we're going to see fentanyl take over other parts of the world in the same way. Jury's still out on that. I'm not sure what to expect about that. It seems to have not at all yet. But I guess maybe we'll see. But fentanyl isn't just sold as it isn't just sold as a powder meant to like imitate heroin. A lot of the fentanyl that's out there today is in counterfeit pills. So a lot of people will buy fentanyl thinking that they're buying a 30 milligram oxycodone or even a Xanax or something they could not even be expecting an opiate and get fentanyl. And these counterfeit pills are everywhere. Like I mentioned, there's been so much done to regulate prescription narcotics and curb overprescribing in the past 10 years or so, 15 years, and to cut into that supply that's diverted. So the amount of like real prescription pharmaceutical pills that are out on the streets today is very limited. So much so that pretty much any pill that on the street today is pretty much guaranteed to be fake. They're just fentanyl and binder. There's no real oxycodone or anything in those. And this is what this is what killed Prince and Mac Miller, and I think Tom Petty as well, was these counterfeit pills that had fentanyl in them. And fentanyl really is like just a nightmare drug. It's really as if it was created in a lab and designed to make everything about the addict's life more difficult. It doesn't last as long, so you just need to have more of it. You need to do it more often. It's a much more desperate drug. You used to be able to do heroin and be okay for 6 or 8 hours or even 12 hours afterwards, before you started feeling symptoms of withdrawal, because that's the constant everyday battle is staving off withdrawal. And that's so much harder to do with fentanyl. You have to redose so often, like every 2 or 3 hours or more frequently. It absolutely skyrockets your tolerance, so you also just need more. It's like they invented a crack version of opiate, really, is like sort of one way that have thought about it because, crack has also a very short duration of effects, and people will, redose compulsively, which is not something that was seen ever really from opiates until fentanyl came along, because it has such a short duration of effects, and people have to, people have to use it more often, and supporting a habit like that is so much more difficult. It takes a lot out of you. It's more expensive because you need it more often. And for a lot of people, that's, that's that much more time that's spent out of the day trying to come up with that money and trying to, put everything together to get something that day. And, more frequent redosing means more frequent injections, which means more overdose opportunities. More frequent injections also means more chance of the kinds of diseases and medical complications that come with IV drug use, HIV and hepatitis C, abscesses and bacterial infections, endocarditis, skin and soft tissue infections. And as if that's not enough, there are now other drugs being added to the fentanyl to lengthen its effects because it is so short acting, to try to mimic a high that's longer lasting and more like heroin. So xylazine is one of those drugs that is showing up in the fentanyl supply. It's not even an opiate; it's a tranquilizer. It's used in horses and cattle predominantly. It is not approved for use in humans. It doesn't even respond to naloxone, which complicates overdose treatment, and it's becoming more common as an adulterant in fentanyl. It's shown up in at least 10 states, especially in Pennsylvania. In 2020, xylazine was found in 25% of all of Philadelphia's fatal overdoses, and last year in 2021, it was in 91% of fentanyl samples from Philadelphia. 91% of them, of the street supply, also had xylazine in it. And I actually had not heard of xylazine until I watched that Vice documentary that I mentioned. They were interviewing a chemist whose team is tracking and documenting all these new synthetic drugs that are out there now. And there was a particular sample of street fentanyl from Philadelphia that he was talking about that was mostly xylazine, with a ratio of 24-1 xylazine to fentanyl. And this is representative of the samples he sees from Philadelphia now. Xylazine is just ubiquitous in the opioid supply there now. And what was so wild to me actually watching that is 2 years ago, a friend of mine actually told me that he'd heard, a friend of mine from Pennsylvania told me that he'd heard about something fucked up in the dope supply in Philadelphia. And I actually found the particular text message. This is a quote from it directly here. "I'm hearing about this shit in Kensington that gets you well for 12 hours, gives you a totally ugly, dirty high, skyrockets your tolerance, destroys your veins worse than coke, and takes days to induct on subs." That last part, we'll come back to that, the inducting on subs. And keep in mind that Philadelphia was largely known, at least to people sort of in that world, for plentiful, high-quality, cheap heroin just a few years ago. And it basically can't be found there at all today. The xylazine seems to be causing vein damage and skin and soft tissue infections. They were, meeting with some people who are living homeless in Philadelphia. In Kensington. Kensington is the particular neighborhood that's sort of like the open air drug market, and they were, talking to people there who were, severe open wounds on the injection sites. People are losing fingers. I mean, real necrotic flesh-looking stuff. Really horrifying stuff that people are suffering through. And benzodiazepines are being used in the same way, which is horrifying. Benzos and opiates are about as fatal a combination as you could get. But before fentanyl came along, this was how it seemed that people most commonly died of overdoses, at least that I had heard of, but by mixing opiates and benzos. But now they're actually putting the benzos in the fucking bag with the opiates before you even get it, and you don't even have any idea. You may not even have any idea that it's in there. So it seems like, and again, I'm not part of this. I'm not part of this world today. I'm observing all of this from afar. And from what I'm seeing, it seems like you'd be lucky to even find the bag of just pure fentanyl. We've now seem to have entered like a fourth wave of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, and also these it's like dirty cocktail of this multi-drug, polydrug cocktail. It's all tranks and benzos and cuts. It's weird, gross, dirty stuff. Some of it's what's weird too is that some of it's pink, some of it's blue, some of it's green, some of it's purple. There could be weird colors to it, and there's just not any fucking explanation for why exactly that is. And it's not a chemist, at least not a professional regulated chemist who's putting this together either. These are incredibly dangerous and potent drugs, and so potent that a relatively minor error in production or in dosing can kill easily. And that's what we see a lot of the time, because there's nobody regulating the illicit fentanyl labs and making sure that they're measuring doses accurately. Fentanyl kills you quicker. It kills you much quicker than other opiates do. The effects of heroin have a slower onset. Heroin overdoses don't usually happen right away. It can be 30 minutes or more after using. It takes that long to reach peak effects. So you have more time. You have more time to help and to get help and to administer aid. You have more warning signs that someone's heading into an overdose, and you can intervene and administer naloxone. You don't have the benefit of that with fentanyl. You can overdose and be dying before you even finish the hit, because it's just way harder to know how much you have. Data from a medically supervised injecting center in Sydney, Australia, shows that even under supervision, under medical supervision in an environment like that, fentanyl is twice as likely to produce an overdose requiring medical intervention. And so when we're talking about fentanyl dosage, we're measuring it in micrograms. In a clinical setting, 50 micrograms is an average starting dose for therapeutic effects, no more than 100 micrograms. A fatal dose is 2,000 micrograms, which is 2 milligrams. So you don't have a lot of room for error in dosing when 1 milligram can be the difference between life and death. When you're looking at a street quantity of fentanyl, what you're looking at is mostly cut, mostly filler, an inert filler to fill out the bag. People have a certain expectation of how much should be in the bag. People who had used heroin previously have a certain expectation when they're getting it as to how much they should be getting, and nobody's going to accept a bag with just a few grains in the corner of it. So the rest of the bag is filled up with cut. And so obviously it's going to be very difficult to measure an accurate dose like this. Another problem with fentanyl is that it tends to clump together with itself, even in a bag with other stuff in it, like with the cut and stuff in it. So in a larger, if you have a larger quantity of fentanyl and cut, and you're transporting that, or you're bagging it up into, you're the middleman, you're bagging it up into smaller amounts. You can have enough fentanyl clumping together in there, in one of those bags, to form a fatal dose, and not even know it. Out of the same batch, you can have some bags with the intended amount of fentanyl. You could have some bags that have no fentanyl at all and just cut. You can have some that have a fatal dose. You can have two people splitting the same bag, and one of them gets a fatal amount and one doesn't. because the amount of substance we're talking about is so small. It's near impossible to know what you're getting. There are fentanyl test strips, which have been helpful as a harm reduction tool, but they're becoming not as useful because they don't tell you how much fentanyl is in there. They only tell you if there's any fentanyl present or not. And nowadays, it's all fentanyl. One of the things that I think kept me alive, other than sheer dumb luck, was doing a small amount first as a tester if I wasn't familiar with the particular products. This is still a good idea, but with fentanyl, it's just not as helpful as it once was. The amount that can kill you is so small. There's no way to know for sure. That being said, for as potent as fentanyl is, you absolutely cannot overdose immediately after incidental contact with it, like all of those cops on the news would have us believe. Fentanyl can be absorbed through the skin. Dry powder fentanyl absolutely cannot be absorbed through the skin like that. Because they make fentanyl patches. I think this is where this sort of idea comes from. But when you think about a fentanyl patch, for the patch to work, first of all, it requires having a lot of fentanyl in the patch. Second, it has to be moist, it has to be wet, and it has to be kept in contact with the skin for a long period of time. That's why it's a fucking patch that you attach to your skin all day. It's a special formulation in that patch that allows the drug to be absorbed through the skin like that. So you can't fucking expect powdered fentanyl to behave the same way. A nicotine patch is a special formulation that allows nicotine to be absorbed through the skin also, but you wouldn't think that you could fucking pull the tobacco out of a cigarette and rub it on your arm and absorb any nicotine. It would be silly to think that. As for inhaling airborne fentanyl, even in an environment with the highest airborne concentration possible, like in an enclosed space where they're literally manufacturing fentanyl, it would take 200 minutes of breathing it in to reach a therapeutic dose, but not a potentially fatal one. So obviously, in the conditions present at a traffic stop, is it possible to ingest an overdose of fentanyl through incidental contact? Absolutely not. Any cop who claims that this shit happened is mistaking another medical condition for an overdose or is just lying. The symptoms most of them describe are not even at all consistent with an opioid overdose. They are, however, consistent with a panic attack, which I think is what we're seeing here. I see a lot of people, and I don't doubt that there have been cops who have deliberately lied about this for whatever reason. Maybe they actually are using fentanyl and they think they're about to get caught, so they have to stage this shit. Maybe that could happen. Not that I think that cops generally are very honest people, or that I would put it past them. But I think mostly what we're seeing is sort of like a God. It's almost like it's like a mass delusion type thing. It's just having that kind of misinformation around. I mean, look, if you've been, and this came from the fucking DEA originally. That's where this bullshit originated from. And so you're a fucking like street cop. You're a real fucking schmuck and a dummy, and you love the DEA and respect them. And they told you that this, that if you touch this drug, you're gonna die if you even touch it. And you've been told that, and you believe it. You've heard about it maybe in other agencies happening. You've seen it on the news. And then, you come in contact with fentanyl. I mean, if you believe it in your head that it's could potentially kill you like that, then it's very easy to see how a panic attack could start and then be mistaken for something else. It's very easy, I think, for me to see that happening. So I don't know. Maybe they're all fucking liars. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be giving them the benefit of the doubt. So, I mean, this is like Havana syndrome for cops, really. It's like a mass panic phenomenon. This needs to be, we need to re-educate our police, folks. because this misinformation is harmful. It is actively harmful to spread this information, because who's actually suffering is the person who's really overdosing on fentanyl, who needs naloxone immediately, and the cop that is there is too afraid to give it to him until his partner gets there with his gloves and his mask, because he thinks he could die if he touches this person. That's the person that's actually suffering. And on top of everything else with fentanyl, if you do decide to try to get clean and stop using, it's actually much harder now than it was with heroin. There are two drugs that are primarily used in medically assisted opioid addiction treatment. One of them is methadone, and the other is buprenorphine, more commonly known by the brand name Suboxone. And these can both be used for maintenance, which is like a longer-term treatment, meaning that you've transitioned off the illicit drug and onto a daily dose of the maintenance drug, and this will keep the opiate receptors in your brain satiated and cut down on cravings and improve the quality of life and improve, provide stability to recover and all that good stuff. And you could be on maintenance for months or years, really. Methadone and buprenorphine can also be used for like a shorter term detox, typically like a 5 or 7 day taper, where you're given, in an inpatient setting, a progressively smaller dose every day to walk you down off the illicit drug to nothing, to minimize the withdrawal symptoms that you feel. Now, these two drugs work differently. Methadone is also a fully synthetic drug like fentanyl. It's what's called a full agonist. Heroin, morphine, oxycodone, these are all also full agonists. And what that means is that they occupy and also fully activate the opiate receptors in the brain. So they bind to the receptors and they also activate them, and that's what produces the euphoria. Methadone does that differently than other full agonists do, because its onset is slower, and while it does have the ability to produce euphoria, although it doesn't do it at all to the same degree that heroin does, and a maintenance dose to somebody with a tolerance would not be intended to produce euphoria. Methadone is much more strictly regulated than buprenorphine is. It's been around for a lot longer. There's a rigid set of restrictions from the 1970s about it that are only just beginning to be loosened up. It's dispensed at a clinic. You have to show up at the clinic. You tell the nurse the last 4 of your social, and they give you a little cup with the liquid in it, and you drink it, and they watch you drink it. When you first start going, you have to go every day to receive your dose like that. Over time, you can build up privileges so that you have to go less often. Some places that's like twice a month. They give you a 14-day supply to take home, and you just go every 2 weeks. Some places it's just 1 week of take homes, and not all places even really do this. But that can take months or years even to get your privileges to that point where you have to not go as often, and those privileges can be arbitrarily revoked at any time. The hardest thing about it, though, about methadone, is that is traveling, is trying to go anywhere outside of where the area that you live in. You might not be able to get as many take-home doses as you would need if you wanted to leave the area. Sometimes they can coordinate it, like the clinic can coordinate it with and you can guest dose at another clinic where you're going to be, but it's a big fucking hassle, and it puts a lot of ridiculous limitations on people's lives. Some people may live far from the nearest methadone clinic and have to drive like 2 hours round trip every day. I knew people who had to do that. Lots of people have to end up having to do stuff like that. And as you can imagine, requiring a bunch of people to show up to the same place at the same time every day and stand in line in a hallway, methadone clinics were particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. Thankfully, the substance abuse and Mental Health Services Administration did loosen the restrictions early in the pandemic in March 2020 and started allowing clinics to dispense 28 days of take-homes to what they call stable patients who'd been there longer, and 14 days of take-homes to less stable patients. And this was extended for another year in November of 2021. So this is this loosening of the restrictions is going to be in place as it stands through November 2022, but they are considering more permanent reforms because it's been studied extensively these past 2 years, and wouldn't you know it, entrusting more patients with more take-home doses did not lead to an increase in methadone overdoses. It didn't lead to an increase in methadone being diverted, which is, these are what the restrictions were supposed to be preventing in the first place. What it has led to is a better quality of life for the patients who now have more of their time freed up. They feel like they've been given more say in their lives, and they feel empowered by it. It took a pandemic for them to make that change, but they seem to be moving in the right direction with that one. No, buprenorphine, that was all a tangent. This is the point that I'm trying to get to here. Buprenorphine is different. Suboxone is different. Buprenorphine is given as a take-home prescription. There's no daily clinic visits. And so Suboxone has become very popular, and it is very effective in treating opioid addictions. It behaves a little bit differently than methadone does and other opioids do. It's what's known as a partial agonist rather than a full agonist. And so what that means is that it does have a very high affinity for binding to the opioid receptors. So it does, very aggressively bind to those when it's ingested. But it means that it doesn't. It has a very low efficacy in activating those receptors. So what this means is that it doesn't produce the euphoric effects like the full agonists do. The high affinity also means that when it does bind to the opioid receptors, any other opioid that's on them, heroin or morphine or anything else that's on the receptor, the buprenorphine will displace it. Any full agonist that's still in the system, if you take buprenorphine too soon after taking a full agonist, and you still have the heroin binding to the opioid receptor in your brain, the Suboxone will displace the heroin and take its place and actually send you into what's called precipitated withdrawal, which is a pretty much immediate, very severe withdrawal pains, withdrawal symptoms. So historically, the guidance was to wait 24 hours since last use before inducting on buprenorphine. That's what this process is called, inducting on the drug. It was advised to wait 24 hours, or at least until moderate to severe withdrawal symptoms were felt before you would try taking the Suboxone. Because if you took the Suboxone then, when the receptors are empty, it makes you feel better. And they used to say 24 hours, really even 12 hours after using heroin, you could get away with taking Suboxone. So we know that fentanyl is shorter acting, is a shorter acting opioid than heroin. It doesn't keep you well as long as heroin did. So if you're sick, if you're dope sick after 3 or 4 hours, surely you could take Suboxone at that point and feel better, right? It seems intuitive. Around 2018, I started noticing that that buprenorphine wasn't working for me the way that it used to. Lots of people will lots of people who use opiates will have Suboxone around for like a rainy day. So run into a situation, don't have money, can't get anything else. You've got that to fall back on. If it's been at least 12 hours, you could take the Suboxone and that would hold you over to the next day. But one day it stopped working like that for me. And for the longest time, I had no idea. I could not understand the reason why. I was thinking, maybe I've just been using for so long. Something is just different now. It's just not working the same way. Because I could take buprenorphine 24 hours after taking fentanyl and go into full-fledged withdrawal 48 hours later and go into withdrawal. I mean, you're already in withdrawal, but you're going to take something hoping for relief, and it makes the withdrawal worse even. The reason for this, like I mentioned at the start, is that fentanyl is lipophilic, meaning that it tends to dissolve in fats. So in chronic use, it's stored in the fat in the body over time, and it dissipates slowly. Similar to THC. THC is also stored in fatty tissue. That's why it shows up in a drug test longer than a lot of other drugs. So with fentanyl, some people may need to wait 72 hours or longer, 3 or 4 days before being able to induct on buprenorphine. And this is a big problem. This is a really, really, really big problem. 24 hours is already a big ask. 3 days of cold turkey detox before you can get relief is like really, really daunting and discouraging, especially if you're in a detox or an inpatient setting. The whole point of a medically assisted detox is to minimize the symptoms of withdrawal. But now all of a sudden, there's no guarantee that the medication will even help you. And this is all turned on its head. And this is all new. This is completely changing the game. Some places that do detox don't even offer medication. Some only do cold turkey detox. And you know what happens all the time at those places? People fucking just can't take it anymore and say fuck it and leave and go get high. Happens all the time. Even in places that do offer medical detox, people leave early and go get high. It's hard. Detoxing is hard, especially when you know what will make you feel better. I've up and walked out of detox plenty of times after entering 2 or 3 days earlier with nothing but good intentions. And that's dangerous too, because people don't even sometimes realize how much lower their tolerance could be after only a few days. Makes the chance of overdose, presents a higher chance of overdose. And it's hard enough. It's hard enough without this new barrier to treatment that fentanyl presents. It's so cruel, right? Like on top of everything else awful about it, like even if you do want to go get clean, there's just more misery in store for you. And this is going to be, I think, a stumbling block for a lot of people. And I don't think that this is even particularly widely known yet. I mentioned this briefly on the show like a couple months back, and it's only since researching. I mentioned that this thing had happened to me, and that it happened to other people that I had spoken to, and none of us had any idea why. But it's only been since researching for this episode that I've come to find out that it's because of the lipophilic property. Like when this started happening to me, when this happened to me in 2018, I couldn't find anything about it in a Google search that explained what was going on with me. I could find other Reddit posts from other people who were experiencing the same thing, but there was nothing even a few years ago that I could find that explained what the reason for this was. There is more information about this now, but I think it's going to require some changes to the way that we respond and approach a detox and recovery. There's some promising evidence for an alternative approach to buprenorphine induction that is better tolerated by people coming off of fentanyl. It's called the Bernese method. It involves microdosing buprenorphine until therapeutic levels are reached. Traditionally, buprenorphine induction starts 24 hours after using. You start with a 2 milligram or a 4 milligram dose, and then, that's, you get to typically a dose of maybe 8 to 12 to 16 milligrams a day, but then that'll be your daily dose. And what this microdosing method of induction is it's done over a longer period of time. It's done over 7 to 10 days, but starting from a very small amount. And what's critical to this is that the patient is at first allowed to continue using other opioids until the therapeutic levels of buprenorphine are reached. This apparently seems to be a way that has been well tolerated by people to do this way. So start off with something like a half milligram on day one, a half milligram twice a day on day 2, like 1 milligram day 3, 2 milligram day 4, 3 milligram day 5, 4 milligram day 6, 12 milligram day 7, and on day 7, the patient's also at that point able to stop other opioids. But what this does is it allows the buprenorphine to build up slowly over a longer period of time to work its way up to therapeutic levels, and the patient is allowed to keep using opioids until therapeutic levels are reached, and then they stop. And this is limited information out there about this, but from what I've seen, what I've read, patients have had success and avoided precipitated withdrawal. This does seem to be a successful way of changing the approach in a way that we will need to change it to respond to the new issues presented with fentanyl. The problem is that detox and maintenance programs require drug cessation first. And the success of this approach requires dispensing the medication for a week and allowing the patient to continue using during that time. So I think we need to take another look at the way we approach treatment if we want to respond appropriately to these new challenges that fentanyl presents. What else can we do? What else can we do to help people and to save lives? Overdose prevention sites, also known as safe injection sites. Proven track record of saving people's lives and decreasing overdose deaths. They improve quality of life issues in places with a lot of public injecting, like San Francisco. It connects people with services. And when you meet people where they are and you treat them with dignity, show them help is available, even if they don't take it right away, building those relationships with people does work. And it helps to destigmatize what they're doing and bring them out of the darkness, bring them around other people, because it's really what is the difference between life and death in a lot of overdoses, being alone or being around other people, especially with fentanyl, because overdose is so quick. And we saw a significant increase in overdose deaths in 2020 when the pandemic started. It was, among other reasons, just more people using alone. The first official overdose prevention sites in the country just opened in East Harlem and Washington Heights in New York City last year. There are some other ones that have been operating in various levels of illegality for a while in some parts of the country. But we're seeing the first shot at an official one, like an officially government sanctioned one, and I think they're really kind of putting their necks out there to see if if the feds are going to kind of step in and stop this. This is sort of like the test case of the overdose prevention sites in the United States, is to kind of see what happens with these ones. I think we may be seeing more of them, but we're far behind other parts of the world in these proven harm reduction methods. Heroin assisted treatment is another one that's worth taking a look at, which is just giving people pharmaceutical grade heroin in a clinic at a daily visit. It's been used in parts of Europe since the 90s with very positive results. Canada is right now attempting a pilot program in British Columbia. It's proven to decrease mortality. It improves quality of life, decreases criminal activity, all that good stuff. And it keeps people safe and provides them support. People are going to keep using if they want to keep using. You can't make somebody's mind up for them. But you can and should do everything that you can to reduce harm. In the meantime, reduce mortality. And these kinds of facilities are great because they put people in daily contact with support. The life of an addict can be a very lonely one. And the overdose prevention sites and the heroin-assisted treatment programs put people in steady contact with people who care and are willing to help them. Creates a judgment-free space that brings people out of the darkness and destigmatizes them, destigmatizes what they're doing, and allows them to build relationships and build trust so that they know when help is available, they know that help is available and where to find it. We can do a whole lot to keep people alive until they get to that point, especially right now with the illicit drug supply essentially being poisoned. We really need to think about providing people with a safe drug supply. If you're listening to this as well and you're curious about what you may be able to do to help people, I encourage you to get trained in administering Narcan. If you Google it, I'm sure you'll be able to find more information about what's available in your area. It's typically about an hour of training. Even if you don't personally know anyone who uses opioids, I encourage you to get trained on how to use Narcan and pick some up. You can keep it in your car, although you do want to be conscious of the temperature. You don't want to let it get too cold or too hot. But I encourage you to get some and keep some available. You really could save somebody's life that way. So I guess that's about it. I do hope this was interesting. I also hope, if there's anyone out there who's listening to this who's like me and who used to use and doesn't anymore, I hope that this was informative if you were not aware of how different it is now and how much worse it is now. It's not worth it. All right, I guess that's it. I love you all very much, and I'll see you next time.